Some stories don't begin with grand moments, but with quiet ones. A snowy grave, a boy, a dog, and a biker who never expected to find anything but silence. But what if loss could lead us back to love? What if family was never about blood, but about who stays when everything else burns? This is one of those stories. Welcome to Veil Marks, where every tale uncovers something deeper. This video holds a powerful lesson, one you'll want to stay with to the very end. And if it touches you, please subscribe, leave a comment, and help us reach 1,000 hearts, because your support fuels the stories we tell and the healing they might bring. The early October air in West Haven carried a hush that only grief could recognize. It had been 5 years, 5 long, bone-cold years since the wildfire took Rebecca Braxton from the world and from him. Luke Braxton, 60 years old and more ghost than man these days, guided his pickup truck up the winding dirt trail that led into the old forest preserve, the Pines Memorial Grove. That's what they called it now, a tribute site carved out of what remained after the blaze devoured nearly everything. But to Luke, it was still just the place where she used to take him before the silence settled in and made itself at home. The truck creaked to a stop. Luke cut the engine and just sat there for a moment. The pines stood tall and quiet around him, branches whispering with each breath of wind. The smell of damp earth and pine needles hit him as soon as he opened the door. His boots crunched over gravel and fallen leaves, carrying him toward the memorial stone that bore Rebecca's name. She loved this place. Used to say, the world quieted down here. Even sorrow feels gentler beneath the trees, she once whispered, running her fingers along the bark of an old cedar. Luke hadn't come back in over 2 years. Couldn't, wouldn't. But this year, something tugged at him. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought it was an animal, curled at the base of Rebecca's stone, a large, shadowy form. But as he stepped closer, he realized it was a child, a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, fast asleep on the leaf-littered ground, using his backpack as a pillow. Beside him, nestled protectively, lay an old Pitbull, muscular but aged. One of its ears was nicked, and a long scar ran across its flank like a forgotten battle line. The dog stirred but didn't growl, its deep brown eyes locked with Luke's, cautious, calculating, but not hostile. Luke's heart dropped as he noticed what the boy was holding. Clutched tightly in the child's small hands was a photograph, faded, creased at the corners, but unmistakable. Rebecca. Laughing, her eyes lit up, her arm around someone just out of frame. Luke took an involuntary step forward. What the hell? The dog raised its head, but didn't move. Luke could feel its stare. There was no aggression, only familiarity, recognition, even. The boy stirred, eyelashes fluttering, a small frown creasing his brow as the chill of the forest air finally seeped in. He blinked up at Luke, eyes wide with the kind of fear that said this wasn't the first time he'd woken in a strange place beside a stranger. Luke didn't mean for his voice to come out so harsh. "You all right, kid? What are you doing here?" The boy sat up slowly, his skinny arms wrapping tighter around the photograph. He looked like he hadn't eaten a decent meal in days. His clothes were too thin for the season, a faded hoodie, one sleeve torn, jeans streaked with mud. The Pitbull, sensing the boy's tension, rose and moved in front of him like a shield. "I just wanted to see her again," the boy whispered, voice cracking. Just for one more day. Luke's breath caught. The boy looked down at the photo in his hands, thumb tracing the outline of Rebecca's smile like a familiar path. The silence that followed was heavy, only the trees dared to speak. "Do you know her?" Luke finally asked, softer this time. "She used to come visit me. At the center, she brought books and told stories. Sometimes she brought him too." He nodded toward the Pitbull. "She said she'd come back. But then, she didn't." Luke's legs felt weak beneath him. He dropped to a knee in front of the boy, slowly, so as not to alarm the dog. "What's your name, kid?" "Eli. Where's home?" The boy shrugged, gaze downcast. It was New Dawn Center, but it's not really home. Not since the boy didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Luke had heard enough. Something in the boy's eyes, an old hurt too big for a child to carry, tore at him. It wasn't just the photo, or the fact that Eli somehow knew Rebecca. It was the way the dog stayed close, as if it had chosen this boy, the way Rebecca used to choose lost things. Luke looked at the dog again. Bruiser, he didn't know why, but the name clicked in his mind like an old switch. Bruiser didn't bark, didn't snarl, just stared back, quietly breathing, the rise and fall of his chest oddly comforting. A soldier in retirement, still watching the perimeter. "Come here, kid," Luke muttered. "It's too damn cold out here to be sleeping on the ground." Eli hesitated. "Can Bruiser come?" Wouldn't dream of leaving him behind. They walked back through the trees together, three shadows against the pale morning light. An old man who'd lost too much, a boy with nowhere left to go, and a dog who'd seen more than his share of pain. None of them knew it yet, but this wasn't just a meeting. It was the beginning of a story that had been waiting 5 years to find its way home. Luke hadn't had a kid in his home since, well, ever. Not really. He and Rebecca had tried once, long ago. But life, and something darker, had stolen that dream before it ever took its first breath. Afterward, their house became quieter. Then, when Rebecca was gone, silence turned to something heavier. Like the walls themselves had started grieving. Now, that silence was broken softly by the distant creak of old floorboards and the sound of Bruiser's nails clicking down the hallway. Luke glanced up from his worn armchair in the living room, a cold cup of coffee resting on his knee. Eli stood just inside the doorway, his oversized hoodie nearly swallowing his small frame. "You can sit wherever," Luke said, motioning toward the couch. Eli didn't move. He looked around like someone unsure whether the place was real. Dust clung to every surface. The curtains hadn't been washed in years. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single photograph of Rebecca, smiling beside a stack of books, her hand on the head of a young golden retriever from her volunteer days. "She said this was her favorite place," Eli murmured, stepping further inside. Luke's heart gave a painful twitch. "She used to say that," he replied. "Said the trees outside made the world feel smaller. Safer." Eli nodded like he'd heard that before. Maybe he had. That night, Luke found out just how much had been left unsaid. It was nearly midnight when he heard a strange sound rasping, sharp, like someone choking. He bolted from his bed and rushed down the hallway, heart in his throat. The boy's room was barely lit by the moonlight creeping through the blinds. Eli was thrashing in bed, his small chest heaving, then suddenly still. Bruiser was already there, on the mattress, nudging Eli with his snout, whining urgently. Then a bark. One sharp bark that seemed to shatter the frozen air. Eli gasped awake, air finally finding its way back into his lungs. He sat up, trembling. Luke reached him in 2 steps. Hey, easy, kid." "You're okay." Eli's lips were blue, his hands shaking. "Sorry," he whispered. "It happens." Sometimes, Luke didn't answer right away. He just sat on the edge of the bed, trying to remember how to be the kind of man who knew what to say to a scared child. "It's called sleep apnea," Eli said, as if reciting something from a textbook. "My breathing stops." At the center, they said Bruiser figured it out before the doctors did. "He always wakes me up. He saved me." 3 times already. Luke stared at the boy, and then at the dog, now lying watchfully across Eli's legs. Bruiser met his gaze and didn't look away. The next morning, Luke drove to New Dawn Children's Center. It was an old brick building on the edge of town, with peeling white shutters and a tiny garden out front that someone clearly still cared for. Inside, it smelled like hand sanitizer and forgotten crayons. The woman at the front desk seemed surprised to see him, but not suspicious. When he explained why he was there, she made a call and told him to wait. That's when an older man shuffled into the room, wiping his hands on a dusty gardening rag. His name was Walter. According to the receptionist, he was the groundskeeper, and he used to know Rebecca well. "You're Luke, aren't you?" the man asked, squinting. "That obvious." Walter gave a dry laugh. "She talked about you more than she talked about herself." Luke followed him outside, past a line of crooked benches, and into a small greenhouse behind the main building. It was warmer there, quieter. Walter sat down with a grunt, gesturing for Luke to do the same. "You want to know about the boy?" Luke nodded. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She found him 2 years before the fire. Used to come by 3-4 times a week. At first, it was just volunteer work. Story time, tutoring, that sort of thing. But then she started bringing the dog. Bruiser, Luke muttered. Yeah. She said the boy barely talked. But he lit up when the dog was around. And she said she saw something in him. A part of her, somehow. Luke didn't speak, but his fingers curled tight around the edge of his seat. She told me once, Walter continued, his voice low, that she'd had a child. Before you. When she was 19, her parents forced her to give him up. Back then, that kind of thing got swept under the rug real fast. She didn't even get to hold him. Luke's mouth went dry. She started searching years later. Said she had a feeling. A pull. The kind a mother doesn't shake. She found Eli through a long trail of documents and half-truths. Didn't tell you, did she? Luke shook his head slowly. Walter leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. She didn't want to hurt you. After the miscarriage, you weren't the same. She said you were grieving too loud for her to speak. Luke blinked hard. The memory of that night, the night they lost their baby, came flooding back like water through broken glass. She filed the paperwork, Walter added. Started the process to adopt him, but it wasn't finalized. The fire. It took everything. Luke sat there for a long time after Walter left. Inside the greenhouse, the air smelled faintly of mint and soil. Outside, the wind whistled low, brushing through the pines like fingers over old scars. Rebecca had loved fiercely, quietly, sometimes too quietly. And now, in the space she left behind, sat a boy with no last name, a dog with a wounded leg, and a man who had been given something unexpected, the chance to finish what she'd started. The circle wasn't closed yet. But maybe, just maybe, it could be. Eli had learned early in life that homes were temporary, promises were fragile, and people rarely stayed long enough to matter. By the time he arrived at Luke Braxton's doorstep, he had already been through 6 different foster homes. Each one had come with rules, some strict, some kind, but all carried the same unspoken condition. Don't get too attached. Not to people, not to pets, and certainly not to the idea of staying. But Eli had broken that rule the moment Rebecca walked into his life. She wasn't loud or overly cheerful like some of the other volunteers. She didn't ask too many questions or talk down to him like he was broken. She simply showed up week after week, with her gentle voice, stacks of library books, and that calm Pitbull by her side. Bruiser, the first creature Eli ever let touch his hand without pulling away. After Rebecca passed, the center tried to move Eli again, said he needed a fresh start, but he clung to Bruiser, cried like he never had before. One foster home allowed the dog to stay. That lasted 4 months, until Bruiser's size and age became a problem. Another home let Eli stay, but not the dog. He ran away that time, back to the only place that had ever felt like it could have been home. He never talked much about those in-between places. He just carried them in his silence. Luke noticed it right away. The boy never asked for anything. Not a second helping at dinner, not a warm blanket, not even a toothbrush. He kept his backpack zipped tight and his eyes on the floor. If Luke left the room, Eli would freeze mid-breath until he returned. Not because he was scared Luke would hurt him, but because deep down, he believed Luke might not come back. Most nights, the boy sat in the corner of the den with a pencil and a stack of old printer paper. Luke had dug out of his desk drawer. Eli drew quietly for hours, shoulders hunched, tongue peeking out at the corner of his mouth. He never showed his sketches, never explained what they meant. But one evening, Luke walked past and caught a glimpse of what Eli had drawn. It was a house. Simple. A single-story cabin with a porch light on, a swing hanging from a tree, a dog on the front step, and 3 figures standing nearby. 2 of them were clear, a child and a dog. The third was just an outline. A man-shaped space with no face, no name, just the shape of someone who was supposed to be there. Luke didn't ask about it. He just placed a soft hand on the boy's shoulder as he passed, and for a second just one, Eli leaned into it. But it wasn't always quiet drawings and cautious glances. One night, just after 2 a.m., Luke was jolted awake by a sound he couldn't quite place: scratching. Not frantic, but deliberate, persistent. He sat up and listened. It came again. Scratch. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. He followed the sound down the hall to Eli's room. Bruiser was at the door, pawing gently, whining low in his throat. Luke opened the door and froze. Eli was motionless in bed, his face pale, lips tinged blue. Luke rushed forward, shaking the boy's shoulder. Nothing. His chest wasn't rising. Panic clawed at Luke's throat. Eli! Hey, kid, breathe. Bruiser jumped onto the bed, nuzzling Eli's side, then licking his face. Another whine, another nudge. Finally, the boy gasped, a ragged, hoarse breath, like someone surfacing after being too long underwater. His eyes fluttered open, disoriented, then focused. I'm okay, Eli whispered. Luke sat beside him, hands still gripping the edge of the mattress. Why didn't you say anything about this? He asked, voice shaking. I thought you'd send me back, Eli mumbled. Luke exhaled, slow and heavy. I'm not sending you anywhere. Eli looked down. Some places didn't want Bruiser. Some didn't want me. I figured if I didn't make trouble, they might let me stay longer. Luke's heart broke in a way it hadn't in years. That night, after Eli fell back asleep, Bruiser curled tightly against him. Luke sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold, replaying the boy's words in his mind. The next morning, Luke tried to bring it up gently. Hey, you said something last night. About Bruiser saving you. Eli nodded, eyes fixed on his bowl of cereal. He always knows. Even before I stop breathing. He just knows. Luke stirred his own cereal, untouched. How'd you two end up together? Eli hesitated, then finally said, She gave him to me. Rebecca. Eli nodded. She told me he used to save people. Before his leg got messed up, she said, even if she couldn't come back for me, he'd know who could. Luke blinked. What do you mean? Eli looked at him for the first time that morning. She said you'd find me, that you'd come someday, that Bruiser would know when it was time. Luke didn't have an answer. His throat was too tight for words. In the quiet that followed, Eli returned to his cereal, and Luke stared at the boy, wondering how many nights he'd sat awake, waiting for a man he'd never met to walk into his life. And now that he had, all Eli wanted was for him to stay. It wasn't about promises, or blood, or paperwork. It was simpler than that. Eli didn't need someone who said they'd be there. He just needed someone who was. For 5 years, no one from Rebecca's family had come knocking. Not for Luke, not for her grave, and certainly not for Eli. So when the letter arrived, stamped with legalese and the polished signature of Meredith Wells, it felt like a stranger had tried to walk into a life she never earned the right to enter. Luke held the document in his calloused hands, reading it twice, just to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. Petition for legal guardianship, it read. Meredith Wells, listed as Rebecca's cousin, and only surviving blood relative, had filed for full custody of Eli James. It was polite, cold, and terrifyingly official. The meeting with Meredith happened 3 days later. She arrived in a silver BMW that looked more suited for a private school fundraiser than the dirt roads of West Haven. Designer sunglasses, an expensive cream coat, perfectly ironed trousers, all armor for the kind of woman who used polish to hide her disinterest. Luke met her on the porch. She didn't offer a hug, didn't ask how Eli was doing. She glanced around the yard like she was examining a fixer-upper she'd be forced to inherit. So, she said, adjusting her coat, this is where he's been living. Luke crossed his arms. This is his home. That's a matter of opinion. It didn't take long for her real reasons to surface. She made them sound like concern. Eli needs stability, Meredith said, smiling in a way that didn't touch her eyes. He needs structure, a proper education, a place without dogs sleeping in his room. Luke stared at her. He needs to feel safe. That's not something you get from square footage. She dismissed the remark with a wave of her manicured hand. I've already spoken to child services. Given that I'm family and you are, let's be honest, not I have been advised that my claim has strong merit, family? Luke asked, keeping his voice steady. Where were you when Rebecca died? Or when Eli had no one? Meredith's mouth tightened. I wasn't in a position then. I am now. Luke saw it then, beneath the polished language and tidy documents. She didn't want Eli because she loved him. She wanted control. And more than that, she wanted the money. The life insurance policy Rebecca had left behind, modest by big city standards, but significant to anyone in West Haven, had named Eli as the sole beneficiary. Until he turned 18, his legal guardian would oversee the fund. Meredith had positioned herself as that guardian. When Luke brought it up, she didn't deny it. Of course, the money will be used for his future, she said smoothly. Education, travel, psychological support. Children from trauma need guidance. He already has guidance, Luke growled. And a dog that's done more for him than 100 therapists could. Meredith wrinkled her nose. The dog? That's temporary. I've already arranged for Bruiser to be rehomed. Eli can't grow up attached to an animal. He needs people. You're removing the only living creature that's ever saved his life. Meredith smiled again, like someone offering terms to a man too simple to understand them. You can fight this if you want, but it's going to court. And frankly, Luke, your record doesn't make you look like the stable option. She left with a polite nod. No goodbye. 2 days later, a social worker came with a court order. Eli was to be placed temporarily in Meredith's custody, pending a formal hearing. The transition was to be made gently, though nothing about it felt gentle. Eli didn't cry when they took him. He didn't speak. He just looked at Luke as he walked out the front door, one hand clutching his backpack, the other resting lightly on Bruiser's head. They say I can't bring him, the boy whispered. Luke knelt down, pressing his hand against Bruiser's collar. I'll find a way. I promise. That night, the house felt quieter than death. Bruiser lay by the door, unmoving. Luke poured himself a drink, stared at it for a long time, then dumped it down the sink. Rebecca wouldn't have wanted that, but he didn't sleep, and neither did Bruiser. Meredith's house was exactly what you'd expect. Gleaming floors, modern furniture, white walls, without a single fingerprint. Eli was given a room with expensive sheets, a shelf of books no one had ever opened, and a tablet preloaded with educational games. What he wasn't given was space to grieve. He asked about Bruiser once. Meredith said the dog was in a facility, and that Eli would be better off adjusting without that crutch. Eli didn't speak after that. He drew instead, a small stack of sketchbooks piled up in his nightstand drawer, every drawing the same trees, a cabin, and a shadow where a man should be. Then came the storm. West Haven was no stranger to sudden rain, but that night the wind howled like a warning. Thunder cracked across the sky, shaking the windows. Meredith checked the locks. She noticed Eli was already in bed, tucked in early. But what she didn't notice, what she never bothered to check, was that the bed was empty beneath the covers. By the time she realized he was gone, it was nearly midnight. Eli had slipped out through the back fence. His backpack was stuffed with only two things, a worn-out flashlight and a folded sketch of Rebecca, the one he always kept closest. He didn't know where he was going, only that it had trees. He knew Bruiser would find him. Somehow. Somewhere. Because that's what family did. Not because they were blood, but because they never stopped coming back. The sky over West Haven turned orange before the sirens ever began to wail. It started as smoke, thin, almost ghostly, drifting in from the western ridges where the pines grew dense and unbothered. By afternoon, flames danced across the horizon like they remembered what they'd taken the last time and had come back for more. Luke stood on his porch, his hand gripping the railing tight enough to whiten his knuckles. It had been 5 years since the fire stole Rebecca from him, 5 years since he watched helplessly as smoke swallowed the sky and ash buried the woman he loved. Now it was happening again. But this time, something was different. This time, Eli was out there. The phone call came just after nightfall. Pastor Jean's voice was tight. "He's gone, Luke." Meredith called it in. Eli disappeared during the storm last night. Nobody's seen him since. Luke didn't hesitate. He grabbed his boots, his jacket, and his flashlight. Walter, the old caretaker from New Dawn, was already waiting in the truck outside. The two men exchanged no words, just a look, mutual understanding shaped by grief and too much loss. As they drove toward the forest edge, the road already dusted with ash, Walter said, "That kid. He wouldn't just run aimless. He went somewhere he knew, somewhere that felt like her. Luke knew exactly where. The Pines Memorial Grove, where Eli had first appeared, where Rebecca's memory lived. But as they approached the ridge trail, another call came in, this time from Pastor Jean again. "Bruiser's gone." "What do you mean gone?" Luke asked. "He got out. Slipped the gate this morning. He's wearing something around his neck. Something I've never seen before. Looked like an old leather collar. Heavy." Luke's chest tightened. Rebecca's collar. Years ago, Rebecca had once told Luke about it. A custom leather collar she'd picked up from a thrift shop, restored by hand. She put it on Bruiser the day she adopted him. Said it made him look noble. Luke hadn't seen it in years. Thought it had been tossed or lost after the fire. "He's headed toward the ridge, same as you," the pastor added. "Might be looking for Eli. Might be doing more than that," Luke thought. The fire was worsening. The flames hadn't reached the lower forest yet, but the wind was shifting. Emergency crews were stretched thin, and the town was focused on evacuation. There'd be no search party this time. Just them. Luke, Walter, and the ghost of a promise. They reached the base of the grove just as smoke curled in thick around the lower trunks of the pine trees. Flashlights cut through the dim, casting long shadows across the path. And then a bark. Short, sharp, familiar. "Bruiser!" Luke shouted. The Pitbull emerged moments later from the smoke, coat singed with soot, eyes wild but clear. His old leather collar, Rebecca's collar, was around his neck, and tied to it was something small and square, wrapped in cloth. Luke crouched, hands trembling as he untied the bundle. Inside was a tiny voice recorder, old, battery-powered. Rebecca used to carry it in her work bag for interviews at the center. She called it her memory box. Luke pressed play. Static crackled. Then her voice came through soft, steady, breaking his heart all over again. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone." He froze. "But Eli's not. He's still out there, still waiting. And if you've come this far, it means you found him. Or that you're trying to? That maybe. Maybe you're ready." Luke closed his eyes. "I couldn't tell you everything. I wanted to, but you were grieving too deeply, and I didn't know how. So I left this, not to explain, but to ask." A pause. A breath. "Be his father, Luke. Even if he's not yours, by blood. Love him like you would have loved ours. I know your heart. I know what's inside it. You just have to remember." The message ended. The wind howled. Luke stood slowly, eyes locked with Bruiser's. "I'm ready." They moved through the smoke together, man and dog, guided only by instinct and memory. The trail was narrow, the air choked with ash, but Bruiser stayed ahead, steady, tail low, nose to the ground. And then they heard it. A crack. A child's cry. Luke bolted forward, ignoring the burning in his lungs. The beam of his flashlight landed on a downed tree, split at the base, its limbs twisted and blackened. Beneath it, a small figure pinned by a heavy branch. Eli. The boy's face turned toward the light. "Jack?" he rasped. Bruiser charged ahead, barking. He pawed at the ground, nosing the space around Eli protectively. Luke dropped to his knees. "It's me, kid. I'm here." The branch was too heavy to lift alone. Luke wedged a thick rock beneath it, using all his strength to lever it upward. Smoke billowed around them, and the glow of nearby flames turned the sky blood red. "You're gonna be okay," he whispered. "I've got you," Eli coughed, trying to speak. "You came back, always," Luke said, pulling him free, cradling him in his arms. Behind them, Bruiser barked once more, a final call to the world. "We found him. He's safe. Let's go home." As Luke carried the boy down the trail, the fire snapping at their heels, he realized something. This wasn't the same forest where he lost Rebecca. This was the one where he found Eli. And for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't walking through the fire alone. The courthouse in Mill County had seen its share of bitter disputes over land, inheritance, and custody. But that morning, the room carried a weight that couldn't be measured by legal briefs or exhibits. It was the weight of a child's future. Luke Braxton stood stiffly in a borrowed button-down shirt and the only pair of clean jeans he owned. His hands, calloused from decades of hard work, fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve. Beside him sat his lawyer, a soft-spoken volunteer from legal aid named Dean, who had been assigned to him last minute when no one else would take the case pro bono. Across the aisle, Meredith Wells sat polished and poised in a charcoal gray suit, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he charged by the syllable. Her posture was perfect, her expression calm. The every image of stability, a tidy suburban home, 6 figures in the bank, a spotless background check, and the unshakable confidence of someone who had never been told no. Luke, on the other hand, had brought nothing but a worn folder of receipts, a photograph of Eli and Bruiser playing in the backyard, and a taped-together dog collar that had once belonged to Rebecca. The judge presiding was Honorable Martha Wilson, 68 years old, sharp as a switchblade, and not one for sentiment. Her silver hair was pulled into a bun, and she peered down over the bench through reading glasses that magnified every flicker of skepticism. "Let's be clear," Judge Wilson said, scanning the case file. "We are here to determine what is in the best interest of Eli James. Not comfort, not nostalgia. The best legal and emotional interest of the child." Meredith's lawyer stood first, outlining her client's qualifications. He spoke of income, property, education access, and a safe, stable environment free from criminal exposure. He referenced Luke's past misdemeanor, a DUI from a decade ago, and his inconsistent employment history. He even questioned whether a child with medical needs like sleep apnea should be entrusted to an aging man with no formal parenting background. Luke sat stone-faced through it all. Then it was Dean's turn. He spoke plainly, focusing on the bond formed between Eli and Luke, emphasizing not financial means, but emotional necessity. The boy has lived with Mr. Braxton for nearly 6 months. In that time, he has improved socially, emotionally, and physically. The only family he trusts is sitting beside me. Then came the moment no one could soften. Eli was called to the stand. A court officer helped the boy climb into the witness seat, his small frame swallowed by the oversized chair. His feet didn't touch the ground. His hair was neatly combed, though one stubborn cowlick refused to stay down. He clutched a folded drawing in one hand, the same sketch of Luke, Rebecca, himself, and Bruiser. Judge Wilson adjusted her glasses. "Eli, you don't have to be afraid. Just speak honestly, okay?" Eli nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Do you understand what today is about?" He nodded again. "They want to know who I live with. Do you know both people sitting in the room, Mr. Braxton and Miss Wells?" "Yes. And do you feel safe with both?" Eli hesitated. "I don't feel unsafe with her." Meredith allowed herself a small smile. "But I don't feel like me with her," Eli added quickly, voice trembling but clear. Judge Wilson tilted her head. "And with Mr. Braxton?" Eli turned to look at Luke. "He's not perfect. He forgets laundry. He burns grilled cheese." A soft chuckle echoed through the gallery. "But when I get sick, he sits by my bed. When I stop breathing, Bruiser wakes him up. He makes me warm milk, even if he doesn't like milk. And he lets me draw before bed, even when it's late." "Do you call him anything special?" the judge asked, almost gently. Eli looked down, then back up. "I call him Dad because that's what he is." Silence swept the courtroom like a hush before prayer. Judge Wilson leaned back in her chair. "Eli, I'm going to ask you one more thing. It's important, so take your time," the boy nodded. "Why do you want to live with Mr. Braxton?" He swallowed hard. "Because he doesn't ask me to be someone else. He remembers how my mom laughed when she got nervous. He didn't leave when I got sick. He didn't make me give up Bruiser. He held up the drawing, small hands trembling. She said he would come back for me. And he did." Judge Wilson stared at the boy for a long time. Her face betrayed nothing. Then she turned back to the lawyers. "No further questions," she said. The room exhaled. 10 minutes later, Judge Wilson returned with her ruling. Her voice was steady, but her eyes just for a second softened. "This court recognizes that blood relation alone does not create a home. While Ms. Wells has demonstrated every advantage by traditional metrics, the bond between Mr. Braxton and Eli is evident and deeply rooted." She paused. This child is not asking to be cared for. He's asking to stay. Sometimes that is more than enough. A gavel struck wood. Case closed. Meredith stood, stunned. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she didn't respond. Her plans, her carefully curated future, had just unraveled in front of a boy who wanted nothing more than to be loved as he was. Luke knelt as Eli ran toward him. The boy threw his arms around the man's neck, nearly knocking him backward. "Is it real?" Eli whispered. Luke's voice cracked. "Yeah, kid, it's real." In the back row, Pastor Jean wiped away a tear. Walter clapped softly. Even Judge Wilson, as she exited the bench, gave a brief glance toward the reunited pair, perhaps remembering that family, in its truest form, is not a matter of law, but of the heart. The house looked different now, not because the paint had changed, though it had, or because the roof no longer sagged with years of neglect. It looked different because of the sound. There was laughter in the halls again, light footsteps in the kitchen, and the occasional bark from a dog who was getting too old to pretend he was still young. Luke Braxton stood by the front porch, a mug of black coffee in his hand, steam curling upward into the late spring air. His hair was grayer now, but his eyes, those once tired, hollow eyes, held something new, something steadier. From the yard came the voice of a boy. "Bruiser, slow down." Eli, now 10 years old, sprinted after the old Pitbull who was trotting at his own unhurried pace, tongue lolling out, tail wagging like he still ruled the world. The boy had filled out some, his cheeks no longer gaunt, his movements more confident. He smiled more, spoke more, slept through most nights without needing to be shaken awake. Today marked 1 year since the day they'd stood together in court and heard a stranger in a black robe give them what they already knew in their hearts. They were family. Today was also something else. The anniversary, a word too soft for what it carried of the fire, of Rebecca's passing, of the moment Luke had broken beyond repair, and then, slowly, found the pieces again. They honored it differently now. Luke glanced at the small sign by the mailbox. A new addition since the fall. Haven House for second chances. The house, once silent and heavy, now opened its doors twice a week to children from the group home in town. Luke had cleared out the old storage room, repainted it with Eli's help, and filled it with paints, brushes, crayons, and blank paper. They called it the art room, though Eli preferred the quiet corner. Sometimes kids would come and draw in silence. Sometimes they would talk. Luke didn't press them. Outside, where Rebecca's garden had once been, they built a shaded pen for rescued dogs. Mostly seniors, the ones no one picked, the ones with cloudy eyes and hips that didn't work the way they used to, the ones like Bruiser. Eli called them Bruiser's crew. Every Saturday, he fed them by hand. Bruiser always ate last, sitting beside Eli like a captain keeping watch over his crew. Inside the house, just above the fireplace, hung a framed drawing, Eli's work. It showed 3 figures, a boy, a silver-haired man, and a pit bull with kind eyes and a crooked tail. They stood beneath a tree, its branches stretching wide, roots curling deep into the soil. Beneath it, written in Eli's careful, looping handwriting, "Family, those who don't leave, even when everything else burns." Luke had stared at that line for nearly an hour the first time he saw it. Today, as they gathered under the trees at the edge of the property, Eli laid wildflowers beside a smooth stone marker. On it were carved Rebecca's name and the words "Light in the Pines." They didn't cry this time. They smiled. Eli knelt beside the stone, one hand resting gently on it. "Hi, Mom," he whispered. "We made her cookies. The kind you used to bring me at the center." Luke stepped closer, resting a hand on Eli's shoulder. "She would have liked that," he said. Bruiser laid down beside them, groaning softly as his body adjusted to the uneven earth. He was older now, slower. His walks were shorter, his naps longer, but he never strayed far from Eli. Not once. Luke crouched beside the boy and the dog. The wind rustled through the pines soft, like a hush after song. He looked at the sky, then at the stone, and spoke in the voice he only used for her. "We made it, Beck," he said quietly. "He's not waiting anymore. He's home." Eli reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded drawing. He didn't say anything, just placed it at the base of the marker. The sketch showed Rebecca hair pulled back, smiling the way she always had when she looked at Bruiser. Next to her was the boy, then Luke, all standing beneath the same tree. Bruiser barked once, as if to agree. That night, after dinner and a shared slice of burnt pie Luke insisted was intentional, Eli curled up in his bed with Bruiser snoring at his feet. Luke stood in the doorway for a while, arms crossed, just watching. He saw the small things now, the details Rebecca had always noticed. The way Eli tilted his head when thinking, the crinkle at the corner of his mouth when he tried not to laugh, the way Bruiser's ears still twitched toward any sound Eli made. He didn't know what the future held. There would be more storms, more late nights, more questions he wouldn't know how to answer, but they would face them together, not as a perfect family, but as a real one, the kind built from broken pieces, and held together by choice, by trust, and by love. Some families are stitched together by choice, not birth. And sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is show up. For a boy, for a dog, for a promise whispered in fire and found again in ashes. At Veil Marks, we believe that stories like these aren't just told, they're felt. If this one moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button so we can reach 1,000 kind souls and keep crafting meaningful, heartwarming stories that stay with you long after the screen fades. As Maya Angelou once said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel." Let this story be one that lingers in the quiet corners of your heart.